Before we begin, remember this. Some portraits were never meant to be cleaned. Every family in the Gilded Age hid something behind their polished frames, but the Lorillards hid theirs beneath paint older than their own fortune. What you're about to see isn't restoration. It's the first crack in a story someone paid dearly to keep sealed. They said the Lorillard family portrait of 1887 was merely another relic of America's opulent rise, a decorative artifact from a dynasty that helped shape the Gilded Age. When the restoration began last Tuesday, inside the dim conservation room of Lorillard Manor, no one expected anything unusual. The varnish was yellowed, the pigments fatigued after more than a century, but it was, by all accounts, a predictable assignment. Yet the moment the first layers dissolved under the solvent, the painting reacted in a way no archivist could easily explain. Shapes too rigid, shadows that didn't belong, lines that seemed to resist exposure, as if trying to remain buried. Inside the cavernous hallways of the manor, a stillness settled, one that echoed the same silence that once surrounded the Lorillard name. A silence that didn't come from respect, but from a century of careful curation. Missing ledgers and testimonies filed in drawers that mysteriously burned in the winter of 1911. The portrait, once considered a harmless display of generational pride, began behaving like every other document in their archive. Edited, softened, corrected. Something in those faces had been painted over, something that shouldn't have been erased. Rumors about the family were not new. In 1892, a journalist from the New York Recorder claimed that the Lorillards had quietly transferred funds overseas during the Panic of 1890, a move that saved their empire but left a trail of vanished clerks and unsigned bank drafts. The article disappeared within a week. The reporter resigned, if that was truly the word for it. A decade later, a domestic worker wrote in a private letter about a fourth figure missing from the famous portrait. That letter never reached its destination. All that remained was an envelope with the corner singed, supposedly from a fireplace accident. Tonight, as the solvent lifts yet another veil of varnish, the image underneath begins to contradict every catalog description the family released for over a century. A subtle shift in an expression, a hand positioned differently, a silhouette emerging where there should be empty background. And in that shift lies the same question that haunted anyone who ever tried to document the Lorillards honestly. What exactly was removed and why? Have you ever heard a story like this hidden inside a Gilded Age mansion? If this portrait reminds you of another sealed room, another missing heir or burned archive, share it below. This channel exists to reveal what the elite have tried to erase, so subscribe before you lose sight of it. What we uncover next may not have been meant for public eyes, but the portrait has started telling its story, whether the Lorillards want it to or not. By the time the Lorillards posed for that 1887 portrait, the family was no longer just another name in the tobacco trade. They were a fixture of the Gilded Age, stitched into the fabric of New York, New Jersey, and the Newport summer season like the gold thread woven into their drawing room drapes. Their factories perfumed the air with the acrid sweetness of tobacco, their warehouses lined. Waterfronts and their carriages were as recognizable outside Fifth Avenue townhouses as in front of their rambling New Jersey estates. Inside Lorillard Manor, the portrait was given what the family considered its rightful throne, a central wall in the Great Hall, high enough that visitors had to tilt their heads back to take in every carefully composed detail. The patriarch's hand rested on the arm of his chair with calculated ease, the matriarch seated beside him in silk that caught the gaslight, sons and daughters arranged like living proof that the bloodline was orderly, fertile, and secure. On paper, the image was simple. In practice, it was a political instrument. Inventories from the late 1880s list the painting not just as family portrait, but with careful notes about its dimensions and placement, as if the very size of the canvas were part of the Lorillards' argument that they belonged among the untouchable elite. Society columns from New York to Newport mentioned it. From time to time, a visiting senator, Received in the hall beneath the imposing Lorillard family canvas, a foreign dignitary, introduced to the household in the shadow of an impressive ancestral portrait. Photographers were not permitted to capture it directly. Instead, they described it, always with the same adjectives: dignified, harmonious, respectable. The portrait did work that a dozen speeches could not. It suggested unity in a world that knew how quickly fortunes could fracture. In a society where scandals traveled faster than trains, a painting like that was a shield. The Gilded Age loved its Golden Age secrets, and nothing protected a secret better than a picture that insisted everything was fine. Behind that serene composition, however, the mechanisms of power moved in quieter rooms. Lawyers drafted codicils to wills that never entered the public record. Clerks were instructed to misplace certain loan documents tied to a failed partner in New Jersey. Guest lists for their Newport gatherings were adjusted at the last minute when a politician's name suddenly became too controversial. A junior archivist in the 1890s noted in a letter that only survived as a quoted fragment in another file that the Lorillard papers do not burn easily, but they do vanish. There were whispers of hidden heirs, children born out of sequence, alliances formed in boarding houses rather than ballrooms. Servants exchanged glances when a surname was spoken that never appeared in the official Lorillard genealogy. In a world of forbidden rooms and silent witnesses, the portrait offered a neat, unbroken line of inheritance, and no one was encouraged to question what or who had been left out. The press, when it touched the family's darker edges at all, did so with gloved hands. A small article about a disputed trust in the mid-1890s was corrected in the next issue. The correction was longer than the original piece and suspiciously flattering. Editors received quiet visits from attorneys who spoke in measured tones about reputations, markets, and the risk of unnecessary alarm. Records in public offices tell their own story through absence. Pages cut from bound ledgers, ink that has been washed until only the ghost of a figure remains, annotations added in a different hand to soften a date, redirect a signature, erase a connection. The Lorillards, like other dynasties of their time, understood that a dark legacy could be managed if you controlled not just what people saw, but what they thought they were seeing. The 1887 portrait became part of that control. It appeared again and again in descriptions of dinners, charity events, and political negotiations held beneath its gaze. A visiting governor was said to have paused in front of it, as if acknowledging the weight of generations. A bishop, according to a private note from a guest, insisted that the family pray together in its shadow before finalizing a substantial donation. The picture was no longer merely art. It was a silent witness that testified again and again to the idea that the Lorillards were stable, virtuous, unshakable. Faced with a portrait carrying that much political weight, would you dare to question what had been removed from it? The question was not spoken aloud in the Great Hall. It existed in the spaces where servants were told to look away, in the corridors leading to doors that did not appear on the official plans of the house. It lingered in the unease of a secretary asked to retype a letter with one less name on the list of heirs. It echoed in the hand that hesitated just for a moment before striking a line through an entry in a family ledger. Decades later, as archivists and historians began to sift through what remained, charred edges of correspondence, duplicated contracts with conflicting dates, inventories that contradicted each other, they kept encountering the same pattern. The official story tilted toward perfection, while the surviving fragments hinted at something deliberately pushed into the margins. The Gilded Age facade remained smooth, but its understructure was held together by omissions and rewrites. That is what makes today's restoration inside Lorillard Manor so unsettling. As the solvents continue to lift the old varnish, the team is not just cleaning a canvas. They are confronting a visual document that was once used to anchor an entire narrative of legitimacy. Under magnification, a contour around a shoulder appears thicker than the original brushwork. Pigment density changes subtly where a figure's outline might have once extended further. A faint line, barely visible, arcs toward a space that, according to every official description, was always empty background. It is as if the painting remembers a different arrangement than the one the world was allowed to see. In a corner of the conservation room, a copy of an 1890s inventory lies open, listing Portrait of Lorillard Family, 4 principal figures, while every later catalog calmly refers to 3. The discrepancy is small enough to dismiss as a clerical error, unless you are already familiar with the family's habit of cultivating erased records. The air in the room grows heavier as one of the restorers traces, with a gloved fingertip in the air, the suggestion of where that missing presence might have been. Not a scratch in the canvas, not damage, a deliberate absence, painted over with care. The brushstrokes that hide it are smooth, confident, and old. Somewhere beneath them, a face once looked out from the wall of the great hall, its existence confirmed only by a line in a forgotten ledger and a thickness of paint that refuses to lie completely flat. For the first time in more than a century, the portrait and the paper trail no longer agree, and in the silence that follows, the room seems to listen to itself breathe. The decision to move beyond solvents and magnifying lamps came quietly, almost as a courtesy to the painting itself. After all, a canvas that had anchored a dark legacy for more than a century deserved to be read in more than one language, the visible surface for society, and the hidden strata beneath for those willing to question Golden Age secrets. In the conservation lab at Lorillard Manor, the portrait was unhooked from its usual authority on the Great Hall wall and placed on a vertical easel attached to a metal track. The lights dimmed, not out of ceremony, but because the X-ray machine in the corner demanded it. One of the restorers checked the settings with the practiced calm of someone used to uncovering what families were certain they had buried for good. Another stood back, arms folded, listening to the faint hum of the equipment, the click of a switch, the shuffle of paper shoe covers on the floor. No one said the word erased, but the way they avoided each other's eyes gave the word a shape in the room. The X-ray plate slid into position behind the canvas with a soft mechanical glide. On the front, the 1887 Lorillard family appeared unchanged. The patriarch in his chair, the matriarch framed in her silk, the officially acknowledged heirs arranged with the quiet arrogance of hidden heirs who believed their place secure. Yet X-rays have never cared much for public narratives. When the first exposure finished with a muted beep and the image started to bloom on the monitor, the room's small noises died out one by one. Bones of the composition emerged in spectral whites and grays, underlying drawing, nail heads in the stretcher, seams in the canvas, heavier pigments burning brighter than the rest. And there, where the official version presented only a calm expanse of background, a curve appeared, too rounded, too deliberate to be a random swirl of paint. It was the arc of a shoulder, cut short and buried beneath a later field of darker tone. No one rushed to interpret it. Instead, they repeated the scan, adjusting the field, overlapping plates, mapping that ghostly arc from one section of the portrait to the next. Each time, the same thing happened. A presence that should not exist in a three-figure composition insisted on outlining itself in the underdrawing, as if the painting remembered someone the Lorillards tried very hard to forget. The patriarch's hand, so confidently resting on the chair arm in the finished image, revealed another story in X-ray, a previous iteration where the fingers extended differently, turned slightly inward, angled toward where that missing shoulder had once been. The gesture no longer looked like casual authority. It looked like a connection, now amputated and repainted into neutrality. Infrared reflectography took over next, its lens moving slowly across the surface while the monitor rendered the painting in a grainy, otherworldly monochrome. Under infrared, carbon-based underdrawing lines glowed like confessions written in invisible ink. Sketch marks traced the initial placement of heads and hands, the hemming of jackets, the curve of the matriarch's collar. But again, in that supposedly empty stretch of wall behind the family, the instrument picked up something else. Faint contour lines forming what might have been the suggestion of a torso, the top edge of a garment, the ghost of a face turned slightly away. Someone had been there once in the planning. Someone had been designed into the composition before being sentenced to the forbidden rooms beneath layers of overpaint. Cross-sections of paint, taken from the most inconspicuous points the team could justify, told the same quiet story in microscopic cross-hatching. Under the microscope, each fragment became a geological core sample of the Gilded Age canvas. Ground layer, first pass of paint, adjustments, glazes, varnish. In samples pulled from the background near the phantom shoulder, the stack of layers grew thicker than in surrounding areas. A distinct band of color, different in hue and composition, sat, sandwiched between the earliest layers and the final surface, evidence that part of the scene had once been painted, then deliberately buried under a smoother, more convenient version of reality. This was not accidental correction, the kind every artist makes as they work. It was structural editing, the kind that rewrites family history with a brush instead of a pen. Other anomalies began to whisper from the data. Near the matriarch's neckline, the X-ray hinted at a small object that no longer appeared in the visible image, a circular form hanging slightly lower than her current brooch, attached by what looked like a finer chain. When the infrared passed over that area, faint traces of an earlier shape emerged. Something closer to a medal or medallion than an ornament, heavy enough in pigment to leave a distinct shadow in the radiograph. Somewhere between 1887 and the present, that symbol had been scrubbed from view, replaced by a more generic decoration. In a family that moved tobacco, fortunes across borders and negotiated quiet understandings with politicians and bankers, the difference between a medal and a brooch could signal an alliance, a debt, a loyalty too revealing for later generations to display in their great hall. On the far edge of the canvas, near the patriarch's chair, another detail refused to behave. Under surface light, it was nothing more than a dark rectangular blur in the background, a harmless patch of shadow. Under X-ray, it sharpened into the outline of a book resting on a small side table, its spine and corners rendered in denser pigment. Infrared revealed faint linear marks on its cover, the ghost of letters once inscribed there. The official catalog entries, stretching from the early 1900s to the mid-20th century, made no mention of any book in the portrait. The Lorillards, at least on paper, had always wanted the painting to speak of stability, heritage, and domestic serenity. Not contracts, not ledgers, not whatever document might have been symbolically represented by that quietly painted volume. Somewhere along the line, the book had been pushed back into the shadows, its significance softened until even its existence could be plausibly denied. All of this unfolded not as a theatrical revelation, but as a sequence of small, controlled moments. A restorer leaning closer to the monitor, hand hovering over the mouse a second longer than necessary. Another adjusting their glasses, exhaling through the nose as if trying not to name the pattern forming in front of them. The faint buzz of the X-ray generator cycling down, leaving the room so quiet that the creak of the old floorboards outside sounded like a distant footstep from another century. The painting, once a proud emblem of order, now behaved like one more silent witness in the house, its loyalty divided between the version it was told to present and the earlier truth it had never entirely relinquished. In the world of Gilded Age estates, this was not an unfamiliar pattern. Families with too much to lose had long used painters, architects, and archivists to perform the same kind of surgery on reality. A doorway bricked over when a scandalous wing of the house needed to disappear from polite conversation. A surname quietly removed from a chapel plaque. An inconvenient child relocated from family portraits to the blank realm of erased records and dark legacy. The Lorillard portrait, under the glare of scientific instruments, simply confirmed that their version of Golden Age secrets followed the same logic. Where official histories preferred clean lines and closed genealogies, the X-rays and infrared images insisted on showing edits, substitutions, and carefully muted connections. By the time the last scan of the day finished, the conservators had pinned a series of printed X-ray plates and infrared captures to a corkboard on the side wall. The phantom shoulder, the redirected hand, the vestige of the medallion, the suppressed book. None of it, taken alone, proved the existence of hidden heirs or forbidden agreements. Together, however, the images formed something harder to dismiss. Physical evidence that the portrait had once told a slightly different story, one that someone decided was too dangerous to leave intact. On a nearby table, an old inventory lay open to the line that still listed 4 principal figures, where only 3 now appeared. The ink of one name had been scraped so carefully from the paper that only a shallow groove remained, as if the page itself remembered what the pen had once written. Under the fluorescent lights, one of the restorers lifted an X-ray plate and held it next to the ledger. On the radiograph, a pale outline of a face hovered where the visible painting showed only darkened background. On the paper, a blank space broke the rhythm of the remaining names. No one tried to reconcile them aloud. Between the erased name and the erased face, the room seemed to close in on its own, breathing. And for a moment, Lorillard Manor felt like it was listening to a question no one had yet dared to phrase. The painting was not the only thing that refused to fully cooperate with the official story. Once the X-rays and infrared images had drawn the outline of an erased presence on the canvas, the next place to look was where Gilded Age families always tried to keep control, on paper. In a small room off the main corridor, a space that smelled faintly of dust, linen, and old glue, the Lorillard household records were stacked in labeled boxes, their spines carrying dates that ran from the late 1870s into the middle of the 20th century. The archivist assigned to the project moved through them with the slow care of someone handling silent witnesses, inventory diaries bound in cracked leather, household account books, letters folded along creases that had outlived the people who wrote them. No one announced that they were searching for a missing heir. Officially, they were correlating documentary evidence with the portrait. Unofficially, every hand that turned a page lingered a little longer over lists of names than over columns of chairs, carpets, and silverware. The first hint came not in a dramatic revelation, but in the margin of an 1888 inventory. The document was routine at first glance, a careful list of objects in the Great Hall. 1 large chandelier, French, crystal, 2 sideboards, walnut, 1 great portrait of family, 4 figures, oil on canvas. 1887. The word "for" was not underlined, not emphasized. It simply sat there, small and unbothered, contradicting everything the present-day Lorillard narrative insisted about their iconic 3-figure composition. Sometime later, someone had drawn a faint line through the U and R, thinning the word until it could almost be read as 1. Almost. The pen had pressed hard enough to leave an impression in the paper, as if the correction needed to be felt as much as seen. In the following decades inventories, the description quietly changed. Family portrait, principal group, oil. No number of figures. Nothing that could be contradicted later. Deeper in the box, tied with a discolored ribbon, lay a set of household administration notebooks kept by a long-vanished steward. His handwriting marched across the pages in a precise, almost military script, recording deliveries, staff changes, minor repairs. In the entries for early winter 1893, an unusual cluster of notations formed. Around the Great Hall, portrait rehung, painter engaged for minor adjustment, frame modified. On one page, between lines about coal deliveries and the replacement of a cracked window pane, a sentence appeared and then tried to disappear. Instructions per master regarding removal of... The final word had been scratched away so thoroughly that only the faintest tail of a letter remained. Above it, in a later hand, someone had written, "Irrelevant. Omit." The ink had faded, but the hierarchy of voices on the page was still clear: the person who recorded, and the person who decided what was not to be recorded anymore. The pattern was familiar to anyone who studies Golden Age secrets. The quiet layers of "don't mention this," "adjust that," "we no longer speak of them here." The more correspondence they read, the more a ghost of a person began to assemble out of fragments. A letter from a New York critic in 1887, preserved only as a copied excerpt in a family scrapbook, described Having been received at Lorillard Manor and shown a new family painting of considerable size in which the younger generation appears in a somewhat crowded arrangement. Crowded, a word missing from later descriptions, which praised the portrait's balanced composition and clear separation of the three principal sitters. In a note sent 2 years later to a cousin in Newport, one of the Lorillard daughters complained about all this fuss over who may or may not be seen in that wretched picture. The line was followed by a blot of ink that spread like a tiny cloud, stopping the sentence from arriving intact. No name, no direct confession, just the awareness that visibility itself had become a battlefield. Legal documents, which were supposed to bring clarity, did something more ambiguous. A draft of a will from the early 1890s, found in a lawyer's bundle rather than the house archive proper, listed "my 3 sons and 1 other issue to be provided for as agreed in private." Memorandum. The phrase "one other issue" sat on the page like an intruder. In the final, notarized version of the will, now part of public record, the ambiguous phrase vanished, replaced by carefully enumerated, fully legitimate heirs. Somewhere between draft and final, someone had stepped out of the line of inheritance and into the category of hidden heirs, still close enough to require quiet provision, too inconvenient to be named in the same breath as those who would carry the family forward. In newspapers and portraiture. When the researchers compared these documents with the faces displayed on the Great Hall wall, the arithmetic refused to balance. There were more beneficiaries than figures, more implications than visible smiles. Household gossip, even recorded in private diaries, carried its own codes. One slim notebook, signed only with initials and dated during a tense period in Lorillard history, referred to those afternoons when the door near the portrait must remain closed, that the visitors may not be reminded of the one who is no longer to be mentioned. No elaboration, no explanation of who had ordered that door kept shut. The architectural plans preserved in another file showed no such door in the Great Hall. The wall behind the portrait was marked as a continuous surface, yet the diary spoke of it as an everyday reality, something you could open and close. Forbidden rooms do not always announce themselves on the blueprint. Sometimes they live only in the memories of the staff, in the habits of guests who learn, without ever being told directly, which wing of a Gilded Age mansion is not part of the tour. The fear underlying these adjustments was never spelled out, but it could be traced in the shape of what was omitted. In a world where reputations were currency and where newspapers could elevate or ruin a family in a single season, the price of protecting a legacy often involved more than simple discretion. Families like the Lorillards arranged marriages as if they were mergers, calculated which political alliances were worth the risk of shared scandal, and watched the behavior of their children with a vigilance that had little to do with affection and everything to do with succession. A child who chose the wrong partner, the wrong cause, or the wrong moment to speak in public could threaten the entire structure. There are hints, never quite solid enough to be called facts, that the missing figure in the portrait may have been tied to one of those dangerous choices. A marriage not approved by the patriarch, a sympathy expressed for a labor agitation at a factory, an entanglement with a financial scheme too fragile to withstand scrutiny. Whatever the exact reason, the response followed a pattern familiar to anyone who studies dark legacy management at the end of the 19th century. First, reduce their presence, then adjust the paperwork, finally, conceal the image. Even the way the family interacted with the press reflected this strategy. In one surviving exchange between a Lorillard representative and a newspaper editor, the family offers an exclusive on a charitable endowment in lieu of any continued speculation about private family matters or the nature of certain internal disagreements. The editor's reply, preserved only as a carbon copy, agrees in brisk, professional language, promising that the paper sees no need to revisit earlier insinuations about the composition of your esteemed family. Representation. The phrase is so oddly formal that it almost trips over itself, hinting at a conversation that has been scrubbed from the record. Once again, the portrait stands in for the family, and any adjustment to the story around it is treated as an adjustment to the canvas itself. Piece by piece, through erased records and altered lines, the researchers began to trace an outline, not just of a missing face in the paint, but of an entire person gradually pushed out of the house's visible history. The X-ray showed the ghost of their shoulder. The ledger exposed the ghost of their name. The diary noted the door that should stay closed when guests arrived. The will hinted at provision without acknowledgement. Together, these elements formed something more precise than a rumor, and more fragile than a proven fact, a presence that survived only in those places where no one had bothered or managed to burn every trace. That is the kind of story the Gilded Age was full of. Not only the shining wealth of those who climbed to the top of the social staircase, but the quiet removal of those who, for reasons of money, love, or scandal, were pushed off to the side. As the workday in the archive room faded into evening, the light from the high window turned the dust in the air into a slow-moving veil. On the table lay an open register, its lines of ink snaking across the page with practiced consistency, broken only once by a savage stroke that carved through a name so thoroughly that only the first initial was still recognizable. Beside it, a printout of the X-ray from the portrait showed the pale oval of a head that no longer existed on the painted surface. The archivist placed the ledger and the image side by side, aligning the crossed-out entry with the phantom face. No one spoke. Outside, somewhere in the deeper part of Lorillard Manor, a door closed softly, the sound swallowed by the thickness of the walls, leaving behind the impression that the house itself was still, very carefully deciding what it would allow to be seen. The deeper the researchers went into the Lorillard papers, the clearer it became that the missing face on the canvas was not just a family dispute in paint, but a decision in ink, witnessed and notarized. Inheritance, in that corner of the Gilded Age, was not a quiet matter of sentiment. It was an architecture of numbers and signatures, built so high that one wrong name in the wrong place could destabilize everything. In a locked drawer of an old roll-top desk, brought up from the forbidden rooms of the service floor, lay a bundle of legal drafts, tied with twine hardened by time. The pages were thin, the kind lawyers favored when they needed to fold wills into envelopes discreetly. Across the top, Last Will and Testament of Drew Lorillard, the first name blurred by a dark water stain that looked too local to be accidental. The earliest draft in the bundle still held the original configuration of the family. Paragraphs marched through specific bequests, carefully distinguishing between my eldest son, my second son, my daughters, and in a tidy clause halfway down the page, the issue hereinafter named, whose position within this house, though delicate, shall be provided for with due consideration. Beneath that line, a name had once been written out fully. Now there was only a thick scarring of ink where the letters had been scored over, then washed, then scored again, until the paper buckled slightly. In the margin, in a smaller hand, an attorney had added, "To be revised per instruction, subject's public association with the family to be reconsidered." It was the kind of phrase that belonged not in a novel about hidden heirs, but in the real dry machinery of succession. As years passed and fortunes shifted with panics and recoveries, more amendments appeared. Codicils were added and revoked in neat sequences, each new document politely acknowledging the previous one before overwriting it. A later version of the will replaced the ambiguous issue with more neutral language. Certain private obligations to be settled from funds not otherwise specified. The figure itself had vanished into that phrase, transformed from a person into a problem line in an accounting ledger. What had once been an almost acknowledged child now lived only as an obligation, a financial ghost moving through the estate's interior corridors. In that light, the decision to strip a face from the family portrait was neither a whim nor an act of pure cruelty. It was a public translation of a private legal maneuver. Who appears in oil is who counts. Law firm correspondence mirrored this choreography. One letter, preserved in a carbon copy from an office in Lower Manhattan, referred to The necessity of ensuring that the visual representation of the Lorillard household accord fully with the arrangement stipulated in the enclosed memorandum. The enclosed memorandum did not survive, but the implication did. The painting had to match the paper, or the paper would lose some of its authority. If you walked into the Great Hall and saw 4 principal figures where the probate court recognized only 3 legitimate heirs, questions might follow. Questions about who owned what, who might contest, who could be persuaded to remain quiet in exchange for a settlement that never reached the newspapers. Even the timing of the repainting seemed to align with key decisions. The steward's 1893 notes about painter engaged for minor adjustment coincided almost exactly with a quiet court filing in which a prior agreement regarding support of one dependent party was struck through and replaced with a lump sum provision in full and final satisfaction. There is no record of a dramatic confrontation in the manor, no diary entry describing a disowned son or daughter storming out under the gaze of the portrait. Instead, there are signatures, notarizations, and a receipt acknowledging that a substantial bank draft had been collected at an address that does not appear in any official Lorillard correspondence. A line disappears from a will. A clause is softened. A deadline for contestation passes. Shortly thereafter, an artist is paid to bring the portrait more in line with the dignified, simplified grouping the family now prefers. In this world, Golden Age secrets were rarely shouted, they were initialed. Lawyers met in paneled libraries where the gaslight hummed softly. Their jackets hung carefully on chairbacks, their voices low enough that servants at the doorways heard only the rise and fall of tone. Pens tapped when someone suggested that a certain name should not be preserved in the same paragraph as the primary heirs. A decanter of whiskey shifted closer as they discussed how to structure trusts so that public filings would not invite curiosity. No one said, "Erase this person," at least not in words that survived. Instead, they spoke of limiting exposure, reducing complexity, consolidating representation. The house, the portrait, the family tree, all were to show a streamlined version of reality, one that the courts, the public, and the press could absorb without friction. The press, when it did brush near the edge of the story, found itself redirected with practiced grace. A small notice about internal disagreements regarding estate divisions among the heirs of a prominent tobacco family appeared briefly in an 1894 column of financial gossip, hinting that not all of those who bear the name agree on the proper apportioning. The following week, a longer, more polished article celebrated the Lorillards' generous endowment to a hospital wing, complete with a glowing description of the patriarch presiding beneath the noble family portrait, which so perfectly reflects the unity of the household. The earlier piece was quietly cut from later bound volumes of the paper, leaving only a fragile clipping in a file that someone forgot to destroy. It was a textbook example of how families like this manipulated the narratives that touched their dark legacy. A story about conflict replaced by a story about charity, a hint of fracture smoothed over by an image of unbroken lineage. Faced with an estate of that size, with land stretching from New York to Newport and investments braided through railroads, factories, and foreign accounts, would you tell the truth, or simply accept whatever the new version of the family ordered into the frame? The question hangs over every altered line and every repainted brushstroke. For the lawyers, the answer was clear. The truth was whatever the signed document and the visible portrait agreed it was. For those who lived in the shadow of that agreement, the excluded, the servants who knew more than they could safely say, the relatives whose letters stopped being answered, the answer was different. They learned that in a house like Lorillard Manor, reality was not what happened, but what survived on paper and on canvas. The more the researchers aligned legal timelines with artistic changes, the more the portrait itself began to look like an executive summary of succession. The patriarch, the official heirs, the sanctioned version of continuity. The missing face, now only detectable as a ghost under X-ray, marked the point where legal exclusion spilled over into physical erasure. It was not enough to remove someone from the will. They had to vanish from the walls, from the family's visual myth. To leave them there, smiling down from the Great Hall, would have been to admit that the erased record still had a heartbeat. So the paint thickened over one shoulder, one hand, one expression. The dark background expanded by a few inches, the frame closed around a narrower universe. By the time the 20th century arrived, with its new taxes, its new scandals, its new ways of measuring wealth, the repainted portrait had already been serving as the public face of a private decision for nearly a decade. Guests received there never saw the earlier grouping. Children born into the later Lorillard generations grew up assuming that the three figures on the wall had always been the whole story. Even their memories, shaped by photographs taken under the painting, aligned with the updated narrative. Those who might have told a different version were scattered, paid off, or simply outlived. The house had settled into its chosen shape, its forbidden rooms. Closed, its silent witnesses pushed to the edges of the estate, or into the city, into apartments where their connection to the manor could be reduced to a rumor told in tired bars. In the conservation lab, more than a century later, the researchers pinned a photocopy of one codicil next to a high-resolution image of the repainted section of canvas. On the page, the line that once named one other issue was replaced by a tight, impersonal phrase about private obligations. On the canvas, the space where a fourth figure's gaze might have met the viewer was now an expanse of carefully modulated darkness, textured enough to look intentional, empty enough to betray nothing. Between them sat a single, thin strip of tracing paper on which someone had sketched in pencil the outline suggested by the X-ray. A head, a shoulder, the curve of a collar. The archivist adjusted the lamp, and the light caught the overlapping documents, so that the erased clause, the painted-over space, and the tentative reconstructed profile all occupied the same plane for a brief moment. It was an arrangement no Lorillard attorney would ever have allowed a jury to see. In that quiet overlap, ink, paint, and graphite sharing the table, the house's long performance of unity began to look less like strength and more like a carefully staged absence. And as the lamp clicked off, plunging the room back into the soft ambient glow of the corridor, the image that lingered was not the finished portrait or the polished will, but the faint, stubborn outline of a face that the manor had tried, for more than 100 years, not to acknowledge at all. By the time the Lorillard portrait was quietly corrected into its three-figure version, the house around it was already part of a much larger performance. The late Gilded Age and the early Progressive era had perfected a kind of choreography in which reputation mattered more than almost anything else, and respectability functioned as both shield and weapon. On the street outside, newsboys shouted headlines about strikes, bankruptcies, and political scandals. But inside certain drawing rooms, newspapers arrived folded in careful thirds, with offensive columns conveniently turned inward. Families like the Lorillards understood something simple and brutal. If you controlled what people saw, you could often control what they were willing to ask. So they learned to speak fluent damage control long before the phrase existed. In New York and Newport, the society pages worked as a kind of soft focus lens over the Golden Age secrets of the industrial rich. Names like Lorillard appeared in columns about charity balls, opera openings, and summer fetes, accompanied by descriptions of gowns, jewels, and the distinguished composure of the hosts. When the family endowed a hospital ward or a university fund, the articles arrived almost pre-written. A photograph of a cornerstone being laid, a bishop or college president praising the generosity of the gift, a sentence or two about a long tradition of civic responsibility. Any editor who wanted access to those rooms understood the unspoken bargain. You highlight the donations. You photograph the check handover. You do not dwell on rumors of hidden heirs or forbidden rooms in the big houses along the Hudson. This logic did not belong to the Lorillards alone. It was part of the broader culture they inhabited. Robber barons became captains of industry after one sufficiently conspicuous gift to a library or museum. Men who crushed labor organizing Monday through Friday were photographed on Saturdays cutting ribbons for orphanages. Newspapers dependent on advertising from the same corporations that produced the scandals learned to frame stories in ways that preserved the illusion of respectability. If a whisper about an erased records case or a dark legacy in a wealthy family's past slipped into print, a larger, more flattering story often followed within days, usually featuring a generous donation, a patriotic speech, or a carefully staged scene underneath some imposing work of art. In Lorillard Manor, that work of art happened to be an edited portrait. Within this ecosystem, the repainted canvas functioned like a press release that never needed to be written. Visitors invited to the Great Hall during the height of the family's philanthropy campaign saw exactly what they were meant to see: a patriarch, a matriarch, and the appropriate heirs, frozen in oil as if nothing and no one had ever disturbed the smooth continuity of their line. The portrait appeared in descriptions of receptions for visiting senators, guests from Europe, and trustees of institutions the Lorillards supported. Received in the Great Hall beneath the dignified family portrait, one article repeated, using almost the same phrase another paper used a decade earlier. The detailed accounts of the champagne, the orchestras, and the floral arrangements left no space for mention of the child who had once stood beneath that same frame and then vanished from both canvas and column. Behind those scenes, crisis management continued in quieter, more practical forms. When a rumor about an internal dispute surfaced in a financial gossip sheet, someone from the Lorillard circle called on the editor in person, hat and gloves in hand, and left behind more than polite conversation. Advertisements were promised. Access was guaranteed. In exchange, the offending paragraph disappeared from later printings, replaced by something innocuous. A generous subscription to a struggling cultural journal could ensure that any mention of a contested inheritance was softened into a vague reference to family business matters, now amicably resolved. Those who knew where to look could track these maneuvers in the public record. An editorial tone that shifted abruptly, a once bold critic suddenly writing in cautious, carefully neutral language about certain surnames. Inside Lorillard Manor, respectability seeped into the daily routines. Servants were instructed not just in how to polish silver and open doors, but in how to answer questions. If a guest remarked on a family story they had heard elsewhere, the staff were to smile, tilt their heads politely, and respond with something like, "I wouldn't know about that, sir. The family has always been very kind here." Those lines turned the staff themselves into silent witnesses, present at the edges of the dark legacy, but trained never to furnish details. Over time, even the architecture learned to cooperate. A wing associated with earlier scandals was repurposed as storage or temporary closure for repairs. A secondary staircase became unsafe and was cordoned off. Plans shown to visitors omitted these spaces, drawing a simplified outline of a house whose complexity remained locked behind doors that no longer appeared on paper. The portrait's transformation fit seamlessly into this culture of controlled visibility. It was both symbol and tool. To stand beneath it during a fundraising supper or political strategy meeting was to accept, at least temporarily, the version of the Lorillards that the canvas endorsed: unified, orderly, and untroubled by the existence of hidden heirs or contested loyalties. Those who benefited from the family's patronage, directors of museums, heads of hospitals, campaign managers in need of discreet donations, had little incentive to peer too closely at the underlayers of either the painting or the story. Respectability, once established, discouraged curiosity as effectively as any locked door. Still, fragments of unease surfaced now and then in private correspondence. A theater manager who negotiated with the Lorillards for a sizable contribution wrote to a colleague about the delicate understanding that certain past unpleasantness belongs to the realm of private affairs and not to the public record. A reform-minded journalist noted in his own diary that our city's greatest benefactors are also its most skillful editors of their own histories. Those comments never saw print. They lived in notebooks folded into trunks, their authors long gone before anyone thought to connect their observations to the X-ray of a portrait hanging in a fading old house. From today's vantage point, the pattern is easier to see. the same mechanisms that elevated the Lorillards as model philanthropists: strategic generosity, curated social appearances, managed relationships with the press, also helped bury the inconvenient truth of who had once stood in that painted group. The Golden Age secrets of American respectability were built on a simple formula: give enough, be seen in the right rooms, and the world will accept the version of your story that hangs in the Great Hall, not the one hidden in your ledgers. The cost of that acceptance was paid by those quietly excluded, their ties reduced to rumors and footnotes. In the conservation lab and archive rooms of Lorillard Manor, those two worlds finally brushed against each other. On one table lay bound volumes of newspapers praising the family for their unblemished dedication to public good, columns illustrated with engravings of the Great Hall and its impressive ancestral portrait. On another, under the cool beam of a desk lamp, rested the X-ray print showing the pale curve of a fourth head that no longer existed on the painted surface. The archivist moved one volume aside to make space, and for a fleeting moment, an image from the society pages overlapped with the ghostly radiograph, the printed engraving of the three-figure portrait touching the spectral outline of the erased face. No headline explained the discrepancy. No editorial retracted the decades of praise. There was only the quiet contact between two artifacts that were never meant to sit side by side: the public version of respectability and the hidden proof that respectability had been edited. And as the lamp clicked off and the room slipped back into shadow, the last thing visible was that faint, stubborn head on the X-ray plate, hovering like a question the Manor had spent more than a century trying not to answer. Long before the Lorillard portrait lost its fourth face, the machinery that would make that erasure possible was already in motion, quiet, methodical, and dressed in the neutral language of agreements. In a law office downtown, far from the chandeliers of Lorillard Manor, clerks copied out documents on thin, translucent paper: memorandum of understanding, private settlement, indemnity and release. The phrases were dry, but their purpose was anything but. In the margins and between the lines lived the real work of silencing a problem heir, buying distance, buying discretion, buying time. This was how Golden Age secrets stayed buried, not through dramatic threats, but through carefully worded paragraphs and signatures that turned scandal into something that could be filed away. In one bundle of family papers, the researchers found a sequence that, taken alone, might have passed as routine business. First, a draft agreement between a Lorillard trustee and the party hereinafter referred to as the beneficiary, promising a fixed annual payment drawn from a discrete account in return for no further claim upon estate or public association with the house, its name, or dignities. The beneficiary's actual name had been scraped from the top line until only the faint impression of letters remained, but the conditions were clear enough. The money would be paid quarterly. The recipient would reside at a distance deemed appropriate for the preservation of family harmony. There was nothing as modern as a non-disclosure clause, yet the effect was the same. One line defined the boundary of what could never be spoken of again. Behind that clinical language lurked smaller, more human signs of negotiation. A note pinned to the back of the draft, written in a different hand, suggested revising the payment upward to avoid future unpleasantness. Another suggested that the recipient might be encouraged to consider opportunities in the West, naming Denver and San Francisco as suitable destinations, cities far enough from the Hudson River to make casual encounter unlikely, close enough to remain technically within reach. The tone was almost courteous. It presented exile as an option, a voluntary removal, while making it clear that the only alternative involved a much harsher kind of separation, one enforced not by geography, but by law and reputation. Elsewhere, in a ledger kept by the family's banking agent, unusual entries lined up in a neat vertical column. Draft to bearer, per private instruction, repeated every 3 months, always for the same amount, always annotated with a tiny symbol rather than a name. On one page, that symbol, a simple circle with a diagonal line, was nearly scratched through by a later pen, as if someone had reconsidered even that minimal acknowledgement. These were the kinds of erased records that defined the darker corners of Gilded Age inheritance, payments that had to exist for the arrangement to hold, but that could never be traced too clearly back to the house with the great hall and the repainted canvas. Silent witnesses to this arrangement included more than paper. In a stack of correspondence between the Lorillards and a firm in New Jersey, a transaction stood out: the transfer of a modest property, described as not essential to the main line of operations, into the hands of an intermediary, and then, within a year, into the possession of the same anonymous beneficiary referenced in the settlement. The deed used phrases that appeared reassuringly dull: full and final satisfaction, without prejudice, with the understanding that no further demand shall be made. The property itself was unremarkable: some acreage, a small house, far from the manicured lawns of Lorillard Manor. But as part of the pattern of controlled narratives, it was unmistakable. When money was not enough to secure distance, land could take over, anchoring someone to a new life where their connection to the old one could be reduced to a story that sounded improbable after a few retellings. Letters from family members echoed this choreography in more personal code. A cousin wrote from Newport about the sad but necessary arrangement whereby one of ours has chosen a different path, and we, for the sake of peace, must allow that distance to remain. Another relative in Europe mentioned, almost in passing, a young man of unmistakably Lorillard features living under a different surname in Paris, supported by a remittance that arrives as faithfully as the seasons on the condition that certain topics never pass his lips. The wording was careful, as if the letters themselves might, someday, be read by the very lawyers who had drawn up the agreements. No one wrote, "We paid him to leave." They wrote of generosity, of providing for those who cannot remain under this roof, of closing a chapter that must not reopen. In that world, the price of protecting a legacy was calculated not only in dollars, but in absences. A family photograph album from the 1890s, preserved separately from the legal files, told its own version of the story. Between pages filled with garden parties, yacht excursions, and posed groups on staircases, there was a single gap, an empty rectangle where a photograph had once been mounted and then torn away. The brittle paper still showed the outline of its removal, the corners slightly raised, the caption beneath it left intact. In the great hall, beneath Father's portrait, all of us together, without the picture to prove who all had been. In a house of forbidden rooms, even an album could become a map of who was no longer supposed to exist. All of these mechanisms of silence, the settlements, the quiet transfers, the voluntary exiles, pointed in the same direction as the repainted portrait. The house did not just push someone out of its legal structure, it pushed them out of its memory. When the agreements had been signed, when the last payment schedule was in place, when the relevant parties had moved west or abroad or into the vague category of no longer in our circle, only one task remained: to make the visible image of the family match its new internal rules, to leave the fourth figure on the canvas. After all, that would have been to admit every time someone entered the great hall that the erased heir still had a place, a claim, a face. So the painter was summoned, the same way a lawyer would be called in to draft a codicil. The steward's note, "Painter engaged for minor adjustment," was the public version of a sentence that might have sounded different if anyone had written it plainly. The portrait must now correspond to the controlled narrative. Under his brush, the background thickened, expanding into the space where the X-ray now shows a shoulder and the faint suggestion of a jawline. A hand that had once turned slightly toward that missing figure straightened, redirected toward the chair arm. The absence went from being negotiated in private to being enforced in oil. What remained on the wall was not just art, but compliance. More than a century later, in the quiet rooms where the current investigation unfolds, these layers of damage control finally sit side by side. On one table, a copy of the settlement agreement, its blanked-out name and careful phrases about no further association. Next to it, the bank ledger with its anonymous quarterly drafts, the property deed marking a life relocated, The letter that speaks of a different path, as if it were a choice made in freedom. And across from them, on a stand under controlled light, the Lorillard portrait itself, its surface calm, its underlayers restless under the eye of the X-ray. The conservator steps closer, the soles of their shoes whispering against the floor, and glances from the printout of the radiograph to the smoothed expanse of background paint. On the X-ray, the fourth outline hovers, a pale, stubborn presence the agreements never anticipated anyone would see. On the canvas, the same space is a carefully modeled darkness, reflecting nothing, admitting nothing. Between those two images lies the entire apparatus of Gilded Age silence. The payoffs, the voluntary departures, the controlled narratives that turned a living person into a line item and then into a void. As the lab lights dim for the night, one small lamp is left burning over the painting. Its glow catches the faint texture of the overpainted area, making the slight unevenness almost visible to the naked eye. For a moment the surface seems to flicker, not with movement, but with the suggestion that there is more there than the official version ever intended anyone to notice. The agreements have long since expired. The witnesses are long gone, the dark legacy filed away. Yet on that wall in Lorillard Manor, the erased face continues to press upward from beneath the paint, like a question that has waited decades for someone to stand in front of it and finally refuse to look away. The more the conservators and historians looked at the Lorillard portrait, the harder it became to see it as a simple piece of family vanity. It began to look like a document created under pressure, with the artist himself caught between Gilded Age money and a truth he could not write in words. His name appears only in passing in the surviving records, mentioned in a bill for one large family canvas executed to satisfaction, and in a letter from a Lorillard cousin who called him tactful and obedient, if perhaps too thoughtful for his own good. Yet the paint suggests someone who, within the narrow boundaries he was given, tried to leave more than a flattering likeness behind. Under ordinary light, the three figures hold their positions with all the stiffness expected of a Golden Age secrets commission. The patriarch seated, the matriarch poised, the heir standing at the proper distance. But once you know that a fourth presence was there, once the X-rays and infrared have shown you the ghost in the background, the visible composition starts to flicker with other intentions. The patriarch's hand, for example, does not quite rest on the chair the way these portraits usually do. The fingers hover. A fraction above the carved arm, the knuckles angled slightly outward, as if the hand is still reaching toward a space that is no longer occupied. The line of his forearm follows the curve revealed in the underdrawing, not the corrected version seen on the surface. It is a gesture obeying two masters at once, one above the paint, one beneath it. The matriarch's gaze, ostensibly turned toward the viewer, carries a similar double alignment. From a distance, her eyes appear to meet yours with the mild authority of a woman accustomed to forbidden rooms and carefully planned dinners. Up close, and with the knowledge of the original composition in mind, the direction of her pupils betrays a slight drift toward the section of background where the erased shoulder once was. It is the sort of misalignment no one would question in 1887. Human eyes, after all, are not compasses. But under the cold logic of technical analysis, it starts to look like a tiny act of resistance. She is painted as if she is still aware of someone the house has chosen to forget. Light, too, seems to conspire with the lost figure. The illumination in the portrait falls in a pattern that makes perfect sense if there are four bodies occupying the space. A strong source from the left catching the patriarch's face, softening over the matriarch, then brightening again in a band of empty air where, according to the X-ray, the missing head once rose. Instead of fading naturally into shadow, the light in that area persists, lingering on nothing, too generous for bare wall. The painter could have easily adjusted the distribution when the order came to simplify the grouping. Instead, the glow remains, like a reserved place at a table where one chair has quietly been removed. Even the empty space between the heir and the matriarch carries the memory of an absent body. In other family portraits of the period, Artists often tucked dogs, small tables, or decorative objects into such gaps, filling them with symbolic gestures toward loyalty, learning, or taste. Here, the space remains curiously uncluttered. No dog, no vase, no drapery flourish. Only an opening that feels like it is waiting for someone to step back into it. Once you've seen the earlier composition through the lens of the X-ray, that void stops looking like a stylistic choice and starts looking like an outline, scraped clean but never fully closed. What would you do if you were an artist in the heart of the Gilded Age and you found yourself ordered to repaint a family's reality? To remove a face not because of a technical flaw, but because a name had become inconvenient to those who paid your fee? The painter of the Lorillard portrait, constrained by contracts and the very real danger of offending one of the wealthiest houses in the region, seems to have chosen the only path still open. He obeyed, and then he left traces that would only become legible in a future he could not fully imagine. He followed the new outline, demanded by the lawyer's memorandum, but he let the old trajectory of light, glance, and gesture remain as a kind of subscript beneath the official version. In the years that followed, other works tied to the same hand did not fare as well. References in exhibition catalogs mention smaller studies of the Lorillard children, a companion canvas depicting a more informal scene in the Great Hall, and a group portrait of staff at the summer residence, all attributed to the same artist. None of those paintings survive in the house today. The accession numbers jump in the archive. Notes in the inventory mark them as lent, not returned, location uncertain, or, more bluntly, disposed of. In one clipped letter from the 1910s, a Lorillard family member remarks that certain earlier attempts, too candid in their representation of domestic conditions, have been deemed unsuitable for continued display. The language is vague, but the consequence is clear. Works where the artist may have allowed the hidden heirs and silent witnesses to appear more openly seem to have been the first to go. Those that remained were either neutral enough to keep or important enough, like the main portrait, to be edited rather than destroyed. In the present-day conservation lab, these choices are laid out not in accusation, but in uneasy admiration. The investigators trace the faint extra line of the patriarch's sleeve where the arm once extended further, the slight turn of the heir's shoulders. Toward a companion who is no longer there, the stubborn strip of brightness along the background that refuses to darken completely. Each of these decisions, insignificant on its own, becomes part of a quiet testimony when viewed together. The painter could not stop the dark legacy from being rewritten. He could not prevent the erased records, the controlled narratives, the forced distance of hidden heirs. But within the narrow freedom of his craft, he preserved a vocabulary that made room for doubt. The house believed it had commissioned a weapon of respectability. The artist left behind evidence. As the camera returns to the portrait, its varnish now thinned, its underlayers mapped, its surface read with the same care once reserved for legal documents, the figures seem to hold their poses a little differently. The patriarch's hand hangs over an absence. The matriarch's gaze drifts, almost imperceptibly, toward a lit patch of air. The air stands in a balance that makes sense only if you remember who was painted out. On a nearby trolley, a folder of missing catalog entries lists the vanished companion works, each line ending with the same word, unknown. And just beyond the frame of the shot, in a corridor where the public never walks, there is a pale rectangle on the wallpaper, a lighter patch where another picture once hung, its outline as sharp as a name lined through in ink and left, for now, without explanation. By the time the 20th century began pressing its weight onto Lorillard Manor, the great portrait had already learned how to survive. Other canvases were not as fortunate. In the years when estate taxes tightened and fortunes that had once seemed untouchable began to look alarmingly finite, the house turned inward and asked a difficult, practical question. What could be sold without disturbing the performance in the Great Hall? The answer, at first, appeared harmless. Smaller pieces, studies, things no one outside the family had ever heard of. The Gilded Age had left behind an excess of objects, The new century would thin them out in the name of efficiency. The evidence for that thinning reads on paper like the ordinary life cycle of a collection. An inventory from the 1920s lists various portraits of no particular interest to be evaluated for possible disposal. A later document, typed on a stiff sheet with the letterhead of an auction house in New York, itemizes one lot of domestic miniatures, anonymous, one large canvas of children at leisure, attributed, 2 landscapes, School of Hudson River, unsigned. No Lorillard name appears in the catalog, only a discreet reference to property of a private estate. To an outside buyer, the works would have looked like nothing more than pleasant traces of a bygone era, good for filling a wall or two. Inside Lorillard Manor, their departure cleared space not just on the picture rails, but in the story the house told about itself. It is only when you align these sales with earlier, more detailed lists that the pattern sharpens. An 1890s register describes, in the precise cursive of a long-dead housekeeper, a companion piece to the principal family portrait, showing the younger members in less formal arrangement, placed in the anteroom leading to the Great Hall. By the time the auction catalog appears, that work has been reduced to children at leisure. The accompanying sketchbook, once noted as containing studies for group arrangement in hall, picture vanishes even more quietly, marked in a 1930s inventory as missing, presumed mislaid or destroyed. The difference between a record that acknowledges a direct relationship to the main portrait and one that treats the same canvas as a generic decorative piece marks the line where curated memory begins. Anything that hinted too strongly at an earlier, more crowded composition became expendable. Not all disappearances came with the formality of a sale. In the mid-century inventories, compiled when the house flirted with becoming a museum and then retreated, entire categories of objects are swept under broad headings. Miscellaneous pictures, unsuitable for public display, removed to storage, appears more than once, followed by a blank where a list of titles might have been. A penciled note in the margin of one page offers a rare, candid comment. Some duplication of subject, best examples retained. Best examples in this context meant those that supported the purified version of the Lorillard narrative, the 3-figure portrait, a few strategically chosen views of the manor, a landscape or two showing the grounds without servants, industrial smoke, or other reminders of the machinery behind the wealth. Paintings in which hidden heirs hovered at the edge of the frame, or in which the missing face from the main canvas appeared too openly, quietly slipped into the category of duplication and then out of sight. For researchers moving through these documents, today, the gaps are almost as eloquent as the surviving entries. In ledgers that once distinguished between Master James, Miss Eleanor, and the younger child, the last category dissolves over time into etc. or others. Photographs of rooms, taken when decorators were called in to modernize, show faint rectangular shadows on wallpaper where pictures had hung for decades before being lifted away. One image of the staircase landing reveals a cluster of empty hooks and a single picture left. Behind, the official, repainted hall portrait, gazing steadily over a space where other faces used to share the wall. The house was not stripped bare. It was tuned, like a story told one time too many, with all the troublesome commas smoothed out. The auction market played its own role in this curated forgetting. During the mid-century wave of interest in American heritage painting, dealers scoured old families for material, and the Lorillards proved willing to oblige in their own way. Works that presented the family as harmlessly picturesque migrated into galleries and homes in Boston, Chicago, even London. A small portrait of a boy with unmistakably Lorillard features surfaced decades later under the label Young Gentleman with Book, c. 1885, artist unknown, its provenance given only as Northeastern Collection. Its sitter resembles uncomfortably the reconstructed outline from the X-ray of the Great Hall canvas. Without the records from Lorillard Manor, no museum curator would have any reason to link the two. That is the power of curated memory. By the time the painting leaves the house, the story that would give it context has already been edited beyond recognition. The main portrait, ironically, survived these purges because it was too central to discard and too expensive, in symbolic terms, to replace. It had become the anchor of the family's self-presentation, used in articles, in fundraising brochures, in the occasional glossy spread about old New York. Families. To remove it would have been to admit that the foundation of the story was unstable. So, the Lorillards did something more strategic. They left the painting in place and cleared away the evidence that it had ever been part of a larger, messier constellation. Lesser works went to auction. More candid scenes were labeled of minor interest and sent to a climatized storage facility that later suffered an unexplained reorganization and loss. Sketches that showed preliminary arrangements for the hall composition, complete with that problematic fourth figure, simply stopped being mentioned. In a house full of forbidden rooms and silent witnesses, the walls themselves learned to cooperate. This is where the ethical questions for today's institutions enter the frame. When a museum acquires a young gentleman with book or an anonymous family group in interior from this world of Golden Age secrets, what responsibility does it have to look beyond the polite label and ask whose absence made that image safe for sale? When a research library unfolds a letter mentioning a portrait in Lorillard Manor that does not match the one now hanging in the current owner's dining room, how far should they go in connecting those dots? The Lorillard case is not unique. It is an unusually well-documented example of a pattern that runs through many American dynasties. Hidden heirs vanish into generic portraits. Dark legacy is repackaged as sentimental Americana. Erased records become gaps that curators fill with neutral phrases rather than uncomfortable truths. Back in the Manor's conservation lab, the vanishing canvases of the 20th century are present only in traces, accession numbers that skip, catalog references that lead nowhere, auction clippings tucked into files like apologies. On one wall, a photocopy of a mid-century inventory shows a neat list of paintings retained for future generations, each item underlined. On another, pinned beside the X-ray of the hall. Portrait is a photocopied auction page from the same year, its thumbnail images of miscellaneous domestic scenes blurred by age. Somewhere between those two documents, choices were made about which versions of Lorillard history would remain visible and which would be pushed out into the market, stripped of names and context. The camera lingers on one particular line in the inventory, group portrait, smaller scale, possibly redundant, removed. No painter, no sitters, no room identified, just removed. Below it, in a different ink and a less certain hand, someone has added a question mark, then tried to rub it away. The eraser has left a faint smeared halo over the word, a small cloud of doubt that the paper could not entirely absorb. And as the shot pulls back to reveal the Great Hall canvas glowing under its restoration lights, the last reluctant witness of a wider, curated family memory, the page with that blurred punctuation remains on the table, the word removed hovering. There like a door in the house's floor plan that no longer appears on any map, but still waits, somewhere, unopened. In the cool, controlled light of the present, the Lorillard portrait no longer belongs only to the family that commissioned it. It also belongs to the people who have to decide what exactly to tell you when you stand in front of it. Curators, conservators, and historians gather around the canvas with laptops instead of ledgers, gloves made of nitrile instead of cotton, and yet, their conversations echo the same tensions that have haunted Lorillard Manor since the Gilded Age. The painting carries a dark legacy, but the tools have changed. On one screen, the X-ray image glows softly. The ghostly fourth head, the buried shoulder, the redirected hand. On another, a draft of the new wall label waits for its final wording. Between them, a question hangs in the air that no solvent or microscope can dissolve. How much, and how directly, do you name what has been done here? The easy we. Documents accumulated over the investigation form a heavy stack. Erased records, ambiguous settlements, letters that speak of hidden heirs and forbidden rooms without ever quite naming them. They point insistently towards someone who once stood in the Great Hall portrait and was then pushed out of both inheritance and image. But the evidence stops just short of absolute certainty. The name in the early will drafts is mangled beyond retrieval. The letters from cousins rely on pronouns and po. Nicknames. The auctioned portraits that might show the missing figure have lost their original labels. In the modern language of museums, this means that the identity of the erased person can be argued, but not legally proven. That distinction matters. To you and me as viewers, the pattern feels suffocatingly clear. To an institution that can be sued, it is a tightrope. In the discussion rooms where these decisions are made, the tone is hushed but not reverential. One curator reads aloud from a proposed text panel. Recent technical analysis suggests that the portrait originally included a fourth figure, later painted out as family circumstances changed. A colleague suggests softening painted out to altered. Another argues that anything less direct risks repeating the very strategies of silence the house used for a century. Their hands move as they speak, resting on the backs of chairs, tracing the outline of the X-ray on the printouts, hovering over the keyboard before deleting one adjective and replacing it with another. They are not Lorillard lawyers, but they feel a diluted version of the same pressure. Say enough to break the old spell, but not so much that you cross the line from grounded interpretation into accusation. Behind those semantic debates lies a deeper unease. How do you treat the Gilded Age fairly when the people who shaped it were so skilled at hiding the cost of their respectability? If you describe the Lorillards only as ruthless editors of their own story, you risk flattening a complex world into a morality play. If you focus solely on their philanthropy and taste, you perpetuate the decorative fiction they spent so much money creating. The portrait has become a test case for how institutions talk about Golden Age secrets without pretending they can resolve every ambiguity. That's why some push to include the X-ray alongside the painting, not only as a technical curiosity, but as an object in its own right, a visual record of what the eye alone cannot see. Others suggest reproducing the altered inventory lines and fragments of agreements in the catalog, letting the silent witnesses speak in their own clipped voices. There is also the question of what to do with the family's descendants, some of whom are still alive, even if they no longer live beneath that particular roof. Do they have a right to object if a museum label implies that their ancestors bought silence and erased a relative from the record? Legally, perhaps. Not morally. The answer feels less clear. In one meeting, a historian points to a paragraph in the draft label and asks, "Are we accusing them or describing a system they were very good at using?" It is not an attempt to excuse, but to frame. The Lorillards functioned in a culture where controlling scandal through money, distance, and image was not an aberration. It was the norm among those who could afford it. To name only one family risks letting the rest of that class slip, once again, back into the background. And yet, standing in front of the portrait, it is impossible to pretend this is just a generic story about the Gilded Age. The evidence is specific. The overpaint is measurable. The X-ray does not show a metaphor. It shows a literal painted-out head. That is why some institutions now choose a layered approach. The basic label offers cautious language, alterations, possible removal, changing family circumstances, while a nearby screen or booklet presents the full case with all its contradictions and gaps. Visitors who want the smoother version can read the wall text and move on. Those who are willing to enter the forbidden rooms of archival nuance can examine the X-ray, the ledger reproductions, the faint line where 4 figures was almost turned into 1. Transparency becomes a choice, but not an impossibility. The ethical tension extends beyond this one canvas. If you show the Lorillard portrait with all its buried conflict made visible, what do you do with other Gilded Age works that may hide similar edits but haven't yet been X-rayed or cross-checked with dusty legal files? Does every painting of a serene family grouping now carry the implicit question, who is missing from this picture and why? Some curators worry that overemphasizing erasure stories will lead audiences to treat every empty space as proof of conspiracy. Others argue that this discomfort is precisely the point. After a century of treating the era as a costume drama of marble staircases and satin gowns, perhaps it is time to teach viewers to read the gaps as carefully as the gold leaf. For the researchers who have lived with the Lorillard case, the dilemma narrows to something almost personal. After following the trail of dark legacy through forbidden rooms, erased records, hidden heirs, and controlled narratives, can they really step back and present the portrait as merely an important example of late 19th century American family painting? The answer, whispered in the way they handle the files and the care with which they align the X-ray plate next to the painted surface, is no. But neither can they print, in museum type, the sentence some of them murmur to each other when the doors are closed. They erased a person from their own wall. In the final formulation, the compromise is as fragile as the paper it's printed on. The label speaks of new evidence suggesting that the composition was significantly altered after its initial completion, of archival traces pointing to a family member whose presence in the portrait and in the inheritance record appears to have been reduced over time, of the broader practices of Gilded Age families in managing scandal and succession through both legal and visual means. It does not name the missing face. It does not accuse any single Lorillard by name of ordering the erasure. Instead, it invites the viewer into the puzzle. Look closely at the X-ray image beside the painting. What does it to you? Change about the way you read this family's story? The camera, in our story, follows that invitation. It glides from the modest, carefully worded label up to the painting itself, its three official figures luminous under the gallery lights, and then cuts to the X-ray reproduction mounted discreetly to the side. In grayscale, the phantom fourth head materializes, the shoulder and collar line emerging from beneath the surface like a memory the house tried to forget. Beneath the X-ray, a blown-up photograph shows the old inventory entry with four figures, thin to near illegibility, a pencil mark drawing a small question mark beside it, added by a modern archivist, half erased, still visible. No voice in the room names the missing heir aloud. The museum does not stage a trial. Instead, it offers you this trifecta: the polished surface, the buried image, and the compromised sentence that now links them. And as the gallery quiets for the evening, the last shot lingers on that wall, where the portrait and its X-ray hang side by side like two conflicting testimonies forced at last to occupy the same frame, one insisting on a perfect family, the other quietly refusing to let the erased face disappear again into comfortable, decorative silence. Once you've seen the ghost in the Lorillard portrait, it becomes hard to look at the rest of the Gilded Age in quite the same soft focus. The great houses of New York, Newport, and Fifth Avenue have long been staged as backdrops for glittering evenings, ballrooms reflected in mirrors, staircases full of silk and diamonds. But in archive boxes and conservation labs, a different picture keeps surfacing. Elsewhere in Manhattan, X-rays of a Fifth Avenue family group have revealed a daughter scraped out of the composition after a runaway marriage. In Newport, a corrected seaside portrait shows a young man painted over with a pillar, once his politics became inconvenient. In each case, the public story stayed charming. Cotillions, opera subscriptions, generous donations. Only the underlayers and the paper trail that survived by accident tell you that the same hands that ordered winter roses from France were also rearranging lineage and memory in real time. The Lorillard scandal is not a bizarre exception. It is simply one of the rare moments when the edits are documented clearly enough that we can watch them happen. The habits are familiar across families: hidden heirs redirected to distant cities, forbidden rooms, walled off on house plans, silent witnesses paid to sign nondescript receipts, erased records replaced with lost in the fire. Portraits were just one tool among many, but they were uniquely powerful. In an age when photography was still stiff and rarefied, the oil painting over the mantelpiece functioned like a press release, a front page, and a family myth all at once. To alter that image was to edit the official past, and the Gilded Age elite were very comfortable editing. They cultivated reporters, leaned on editors, donated to institutions, and learned exactly how far a discreet check could push an awkward paragraph off the page. What Lorillard Manor shows us is that the same instinct extended to the walls of their own homes. If reality became inconvenient, you adjusted the narrative in ink and in paint. Today, when museums and researchers talk about Golden Age secrets, they are no longer asking whether such manipulations happened, but how many we have failed to see. How many canvases still hang in quiet galleries with one figure too few? How many anonymous sitters in study portraits are, in fact, the faces that were exiled from the grand compositions? And how many doors in those palaces, carefully omitted from the surviving floor plans, once opened onto rooms where the edited parts of the story were stored away? As the camera returns from this wider map of mansions and missing figures to the half-dark hall at Lorillard Manor, the great portrait waits under its new lights. 3 figures on the surface, 4 in the X-ray, while, just beyond it, a narrow service door appears in the old blueprints and nowhere in the present-day tour. Its outline shows faintly under the wallpaper, like a name crossed out so thoroughly it was never supposed to be read again. In the end, the room is almost as quiet as the day the portrait was first unveiled. The lights have been lowered, the documents returned to their acid-free boxes, the last X-ray plate slid back into its folder. What remains in front of us is deceptively simple. A late 19th century family group on a restored canvas, its surface calm, its history anything but. We can now point to what is certain: the late layers of paint, the buried outline of a 4th head, the trail of altered wills and carefully worded agreements, the long choreography of respectability and erasure. And we can also see the limits of the record. No transcript of the conversations where the decision was taken, no surviving voice to admit who gave the order, no written trace of the private fear that made a single face unacceptable on the wall of Lorillard Manor. The painting stands, therefore, as both evidence and refusal. It confirms that the Gilded Age elite did not simply build palaces. They curated their own past while they were still living it, smoothing genealogies, silencing hidden heirs, turning dark legacy into decor. Yet even now, the portrait withholds as much as it yields. There are gestures that do not quite resolve, glances that seem to address an absence, passages of overpaint that will never be lifted without destroying what remains. The canvas has become an archive of everything the family tried to hide and, in the end, could not entirely bury. If you wish to keep examining not only what the elite chose to display, but what they tried to conceal inside their own frames, stay with us. There are other halls, other archives, other silent witnesses waiting in the dust. Subscribe so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. If this story resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. And if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth. This portrait now hangs between those two worlds, the official story and the one that presses up from underneath, waiting patiently for the next pair of eyes that understands it was never just a picture.